Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Flummerfeld, and this is your lecture number 5 for school business management. In this lecture, we're going to go over a brief history of education and school business management. Basically, all of the news historically is really good for educational funding. And also, we're going to be taking a look at where sources of funding come, and also what the options are for schools, both constitutionally, legally, and also based on local and state governance, what works for equity, equality, and adequacy, which has become a big, big issue in school funding. And we'll talk a little bit more about adequacy in the next lecture when we review the different funding sources in a little bit more detail. But this will just give you some groundwork here to go ahead and understand where funding comes from and how it all works. Well, first of all, a lot of people may not know this about the state's rights in education, but actually the U.S. Constitution does not give the federal government a role in education. This is quite amazing when you understand this constitutionally, how the role of federal government has grown in terms of education, but it's not constitutionally given. However, we'll see here in a minute why we do rely very heavily on federal funding and when all of this started back in the 1950s. So if you follow this, what's happened here is we have the idea here that powers are not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved for the states respectively. So because the U.S. Constitution does not give the federal government a specific role in education, that means that that power is automatically delegated to the states. And so our state departments of ed, ideally, should be the most powerful educational agencies that we deal with within the government. However, the federal government has maintained a very critical role in education. And part of that started way back in, part of that started way back in 1875 and 87. And we'll look at some of these documents here in a minute, just so that you understand where they're coming from. But through the Northwest Ordinance, the federal government had the authority to provide land for every state township. And so because of that, the federal government was basically ensuring that there was going to be education in the states, even though the power to run the educational system exists within the states. So this is how we get land and property on which our schools and even our university systems were built and so on. Much of that was done through the wording of the Northwest Ordinance. Then if we follow this other train of thought, however, federal funding is well established, and the way that that has been established is through legal means and what's known as case law. So legally, some things were created to provide funding sources from the federal government, and these are making up a smaller percentage of our budgets for education in the state, but they're still really important. Back in 1957, the National Defense Educational Agency was a way to provide funding, and this was really focused on our STEM areas, our science and math. And at that time, we didn't call it technology, but it would be very closely related to that. And this was sort of a result of when we got into a space race with the Russians over Sputnik, and we realized that, we needed to really beef up what was happening in that area. So the federal government came in and provided funds way back in 1957 and set up this National Defense Education Agency. Then we also continued on with other needs, and because of what is in the US Constitution regarding the general welfare clause, and we're going to look at this very closely. You know, it's the idea that everyone is entitled, everyone is equal, and everyone is entitled to the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so because of that, what happened was poverty was being understood as a great divider in welfare, and poverty was making it difficult for some people to have access to what they needed to have access to, an education, to be successful. So Lyndon Johnson was a great civil rights activist, along with many, many others, Martin Luther King and so on, all during this era. And there was so much that that changed for us in this country to really be inclusive and really understand what equality meant. So the Educational Secondary and Education Act of 1965 was passed, and this was making sure that for students in poverty, that they were getting some of the assistance, so school systems and so on were getting some federal funds to help through ESEA. And then, of course, we all know about NCLB, and which is now called ESSA, where it was No Child Left Behind. Now it is the Elementary and Secondary Schools Act, and that was in 2001 and beyond. And so we're continuing to fund this and remain committed to this. And so the whole thing around all of this funding and education is that we still realized, even in 1975, that we had to do more. So the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities and Education Act, was started, and we started to realize that there were other services, like, for instance, through Health and Human Services, where we could provide Head Start and so on. So all of those programs started to emerge based on federal funding. And so we see a lot of our categorical funding and title programs and so on coming under this era in the 70s. So you can see that even though the feds aren't supposed to be running education, they have a major role in funding. And then we start to get a little bit confused about what is the role of the federal government in education, because you know, should we have more of a nationalized purpose and so on? And we've talked about that in a previous lecture, and we'll look at that again, because, you know, we just have sort of a split. We don't have a cohesive, nationalized view of education, and that's good and it's bad. I mean, it has advantages and disadvantages, but certainly you can kind of maybe understand now why we are, you know, we see some pushes for shared standards, for instance. And, you know, a lot of our testing programs are basically national, you know, they're all nationally normed. So PSAT, SAT, ACT, and so on, they're nationally normed tests. And so then it, you know, it has us in education taking a look at that, but there's still this conflict because there's this basic constitutional role that is not given so to the federal government. So it becomes really confusing for us, I think. And, you know, we do our best to sort it out as decades and so on move along. So when you're looking at school funding, you know, basically there's a bunch of things that have to happen. Is, first of all, funds have to be generated. And so we can see then that the federal government has a role in providing funding. It's not a major role, but it's a very important role. Then the states do, then also local school districts do, and so on. So we'll get into some more detail on that later. Once the funds are generated, then within a school system, whether it's a county-based system or a locally based system, it depends on how the state governance has it set up. In Michigan, we're set on local school districts. In other states, like all around the country, you'll find examples where it's county-based. And so each school system is huge and very, very big, and sometimes very bureaucratic, of course. So it can be problematic that way. But economy of scale also is possible. So anyway, we're generating the funds, we're distributing them. And as we're distributing them, we're making decisions how we're going to allocate those. And then even when they're allocated, then they have to be spent. They have to be spent by districts, by local, by schools, by programs, and so on. So there is a lot of activity that happens here, and everything that happens around generating, distributing, allocating, and spending is very, very in-depth and complex. So in this course, because you're not actually training to be a school business manager or an associate or assistant superintendent of the business office, you're taking more of a broad view, but you need to understand here how important all of this is in the work that happens. And then, of course, everything has to be accounted for. So as things are being spent, the daily books of the business through accounting, as we learned about in a previous lecture, they're all being tabulated and kept track of, and then audited. And so auditing will take place on a regular basis, both internally and externally. And that is also required by state law, that there is a responsibility to have the books of the business of the school system audited and shown to be clean. So this is where, we're going to get into some dilemmas when maybe spending has happened that has been inappropriate. I mean, there's been many, many examples of school systems where funds are generated, distributed, allocated, and spent, but not spent according to how they're allocated. And this is where then, people get in trouble. I mean, you can have a criminal prosecution if you're stealing funds, and this happens. Believe me, it happens all of the time. And so we have to be very aware of that, and our accounting and auditing services and activities will help us with that. All right, so we know then kind of where funds basically come from and the activities around them. And so let's take a little bit more detailed look at this. So when we look at the federal government, what happens is, of course, taxes are coming into the federal government. There are wealth taxes, there are income taxes, there are use taxes, there are compensation taxes, there are, privilege taxes, and then they go out through grants or programs. And those grants or programs are basically looking at both equality and both what's known as vertical and horizontal equity. So when the taxes come in, they're coming in based on whatever kinds of federal programs, tax programs are happening. They come in through the business community, they come in through, individuals and so on who pay into the federal tax system. And so all of those are coming in, and then monies are going out based on equality and vertical and horizontal equity. So in the state, here's what happens. Now the federal dollars come in, and also state taxes are coming in, again, through the same means, depending upon whatever your state does. So, in the state of Michigan, we decide how much are we going to charge if you buy cigarettes. That's a use tax. How much how many taxes are going to be charged to businesses based on their income? How much is charged to people based on their wealth or other forms of compensation? So the taxes come in, and then again, programs and grants are sending them out. So the state has different different programs for funding and different grant programs also. Now in the local area, there are local taxes that come in. They're collected through things like millages and assessments and campaigns. And so taxes are coming into the local district as well. And also a lot of times local districts will take donations. So maybe someone a business or two wants to donate to create a new athletic field, or, to provide some kind of services or whatever to the school system. So there are both taxes and donations. And of course, our PTO, PTA, PTSAs, they do a lot of work to donate to individual buildings, on a yearly basis. And then the local district will then have different programs that they're running, whatever their funding and campaigns and so on, and that's how monies are going out. So you can see there's a shift here, a little bit of a shift in what happens, but it's definitely a layered approach. And when we look at overall, and this is from the Peterson Foundation in 2021, you can see here that the federal government consists of 11% of the funding. The state provides 45%, and then locally we have 44%. Now, of course, this is nationally. So for the state of Michigan, it's going to look different. And depending upon what your district has available locally, and depending upon the state's economy, these percentages will vary. And of course, the feds also will change their funding levels as well, because this is something, all of these are approved by governments, Congress, and boards of education and so on, and overseen as well. So these are not exact percentages. This is from 2021, again, a national average. So your system may be in a very different situation. So here's what happens here in terms of basically what's happening with Michigan funding, and this is for public schools. So here's our federal funding. So we have our federal aid, and it comes into our state school aid fund. And then we also have federal aid coming in, and this money is starting to run out. I think we're at the tail end of it this year, but there was a little pocket or pot of gold there from COVID, where the American Recovery and Investment Act did provide funds to schools, and that was for, like air quality and cleanliness and things like that. And some school systems decided to just allocate those over a period of time. Some spent them all at once, depending upon the situation there. But this is coming to an end. Then, of course, we have the Federal Education Jobs Act. We have federal funds that go to the General Education Fund. Then we have reimbursement from the feds for math and science centers. Again, this stems back to that national defense education. And here's our Nickelby and ESAA, along with all the title and categorical funds. And then we also have federal funding for our school lunch reimbursement. So this is as it stands today in the state of Michigan. This is pretty accurate. Then we move into the state funding. So of course we have funds for special ed. We have funds for educational performance, for MEP testing, for the Michigan Virtual School, and then all of our categorical programs. On a local level, we have the property taxes that are coming in. We have what's known as our Proposal A, hold harmless millage. And this happened back in the 90s, where there were specific rules that were set up through the legislature. And those got revamped over a couple of years, but they've kind of stuck in their sort of working. Let me put it that way. We'll get into more detail on that later. And then we have whatever is allowed locally in terms of enhancement millages. So your school system may have in place a given enhancement millage where it's provided that a certain percentage of local income that comes in is going to be given to the schools. And then also schools, of course, can run what are known as bond campaigns, and we'll look at that in more detail later. So this is basically all the things that are going on in order to support education. So, it's really good news overall in that, education is seen as the cornerstone of our society, of our nation. And I want to show you how the thinking developed from when, the Pilgrims started here and are started to change, what was here, and a new governance system emerged. And in 1776, when the country was founded, what happened, and then some of the documentation, including the Northwest Ordinance that was developed. And what I'm trying to show you here is the thinking that evolved around supporting education as a fundamental piece of what constitutionally the United States is about. And so to me, this is really good news for education and educational funding. We'll have a fundamental constitutional crisis if schools are not properly funded and if states are not able to do that adequately. So let's take a look at some of this. And this, is for some of you who enjoy American history. If you don't, it's fine. But just thought it'd be important for you guys to know where all this stuff comes from and that it's always evolving. I mean, even now, we'll talk about bonds in another lecture and you'll see everything is evolving all the time. So it's a lot to keep track of. But basically, in 1620, the Pilgrims came over. They had the mission and vision here, right? It was religious. It was about faith and also honoring king and country, which would have been Great Britain. And so they were thinking of this colonizing within Virginia as an extension of England. Well, that really didn't work out very well because a decade later or a century later, the founding of America emerged. And this was all based on this idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is so important because this is what sets us up in education to be such a cornerstone of our society, because education is the way that we unlock the potential here for what's possible in what was intended. So the unalienable rights that are given are fundamental and inherent, right? And so this is what we are going for here, is that we cannot, the states and the feds cannot deprive anyone of this, and it is given. And so we want to make sure that we understand here that all men are created equal. Everyone's created equal. And this was seen as God-given or, just given to people. It's a gift. Everyone has free will. No one can tell you what to do. You can do whatever you want. Now, there may be costs and consequences to it, but you have that free will. And so in response to that, we're looking at equality, and this is the basis for life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, which education unlocks. And so further on, in just a few years later, Thomas Jefferson wanted to be really clear, is that these, this idea that, the United States is now a nation, and we have removed their only firm basis. We have a conviction in the minds of people that liberties are given. He calls it a gift of God. They're not to be violated, and we need to make sure, and this is where we can begin to see social justice even back then, that his justice cannot sleep forever. So it's the idea is if we don't believe in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that's not done equally for all, then certainly it's time for social justice. And so now we see, as things develop further, George Washington, said that, listen, we have to do what we say we're going to do. We can't, otherwise, how can we defend work? This is what we need to do. So he's saying, let's raise a standard to which the wise and honest can adhere to. So again, this is very passionate. This is very much about, listen, we're talking about this stuff. We're trying to get this in place and make this happen. And so when the Northwest Ordinance was established, we also find in the Establishment Clause, as I mentioned earlier, that we're having this declaration here that religion, morality, knowledge, right, is being necessary to good government. This is really overtly stated, the happiness of mankind. Schools and the means of education shall forever be encouraged. So you can see here that this has all been a part of the development of thought and thinking as the nation developed as you know, as the United States, and that education and schools and happiness are all tied together. And so in 1789, there was some, you know, that's when Thanksgiving was established, so we could be thankful, so that there is a constitution of government for safety and happiness. So again, you know, when we look at what was developing here, what we're thinking about, it was really paramount that we had school systems, right, that were developing and in place, and that people had access to those. And I think a lot of work was done right here at the beginning. And so now we come to the idea, of course, that all men are equal. And then we saw the work that was done in the 60s and 70s to meet some of the equitable needs that we have so that all children can learn. And so when we think about this, you know, with no child left behind, what does this mean? What does this mean in terms of funding? What does this look like? And how does it affect our budgets and our school business management? And are we doing enough for equity, equality, and so on as a local school system? And the same question for the state and the feds. And then, you know, then we'll also look at adequacy here in a minute. So these things are really on everyone's minds. And so that we know that from the Declaration of Independence, that all children are created equal. And so what does this mean? And so we know that, and this is part of the reason why the federal government was not seen as having auspice over education, that it was given to the states and the states give it to their local districts, because we are trying to honor the idea that they're created equally, but we're looking for, you know, individuality, right, against common standards, but we're trying to use equity to meet those individual needs. And so this is kind of what we have taken on and in education. And so, you know, this question is, what is the connection between all children can learn and all children are created equal? Do these mean the same things in terms of equality and equity? And how does your school system apply this? And so it's really something that, you know, that has to be wrestled with for sure, and thought through in a very thoughtful way. And so when we think about the similarities and differences between all children can learn and all children are created equally, how are these things the same? Well, certainly these are both moral, represent the moral imperative of education, which has been adopted like from the very beginning, as I showed you, that this is our moral imperative and our constitutional imperative in education. And this gives us some information about how people should be treated, and that we have to recognize the diversity within people. And so one statement is actually more about equity. All children can learn. This is the question of equity, more about equity, in my view. And this statement, all children are created equal, is more about everyone being created equal and having access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So we have to look at this because, again, these are some founding ideas of our democratic civil society. And we have to be thinking about this and making sure that we are, you know, again, working within the moral imperative of education. And so when we see these things not happening, then it becomes problematic for sure. And it won't be happening largely because of funding decisions, the way things are being generated, allocated, spent, and so on. And our auditing should help us with that to tell this. So people are different, learners are different. Everyone does have equal rights that should be enjoyed. So this means that it's like impossible to not be looking at the equity question within schools. There isn't any other way, in my view, to get to it without a concern about equity. So if you look at equity is different treatment as an experience, and equality as same treatment as a right of access, then this kind of makes it a little easier, in my view, to comprehend and then make decisions, right? So, if a student gets in trouble in the classroom, what do? You have a code of conduct, and you have resources, some resources perhaps in the school. You have counselors and perhaps some other coaches and so on. And so, what are you going to do? How do you look at this? Well, you're really probably going to be balancing the equity equality equation, because you almost have to do that in order to get through to a solution that works for everyone and for the student. And so it becomes, again, this is you have to be a very well-informed leader to understand this and understand what it means. So when we talk about equity, we're talking about open-handedness, right? That you're trying to be situational, that you're trying to meet the needs of the situation, meet the needs of the student. When you look at equality, you're trying to say, listen, we have this common ground, and this is where we secure our equal footing and equal access to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And so, there's a lot to think about here. What do you do? A group of females who are ice hockey skaters want an ice hockey team. There's a boys team. Do we allow a female team? Well, that seems pretty obvious if you're looking at both equity and equality. Let's say that you have students who, because of their religious preferences, they want to quietly and unobtrusively pray at lunch and after school in a closed room. Do we allow that? Well, you look at equity and equality and you say, well, yeah, that's not a problem. So a way to think about this with equity and equality is everyone gets the same box to stand on with equality. Now, if you look at equity, maybe not everyone actually needs a box to stand on. So for those who don't need it, because we have a limited pot, we don't have an unlimited number of boxes. So what we'll do is we'll give more boxes to the shortest person here to see over the fence, you see? And so, again, we're balancing both equality and equity. And this is a matter of where do the funds go? How do we allocate, spend, and then audit those funds? Now, another way to think about equity is by thinking about things that happen more or less at the root cause. And so why is there offense here to begin with? Why do we have to allocate these resources for these kids to look over the fence? We say, well, let's actually get rid of the fence. And so this is an example of if you're transferring equity, you go from equality to a transfer of equity. But if you go equity by addition, now you are liberating, right? And so this is really what we want to do. So we'll see a lot of those programs like, we know Head Start works and so on. They're trying to get at the root cause and provide some equity in the system by getting at the root cause. And so those programs are really the best when we can treat things that way. So when you're looking at where to spend the money and how to spend it, this is really the best solution in my view. So when we look at how to fund students, how do we do this? So we will have, combinations here, right? We've talked about this mission-based budgeting. This is where you take everything down to the mission and you weigh it against, does this make sense? Do we need this? Is this actually what we want to do? Or zero-based budgeting, where you're actually saying, justifying the program. So these are very similar, but site-based budgeting then is a way that we can actually allocate the funds versus through a centralized means. So a lot of times we find sort of a weighted student funding formula coming out, where you have a combination of mission-based, zero-based, site-based budgeting going on. And as we've learned about before, we have to have then, for this to work, there has to be principal empowerment where everyone grasps true north, right? So true north is, again, where are we going? How are we getting there? Where are we at now? What do we need to do to change that? And so principal empowerment is really fundamentally about continuous improvement, which is what we call for in my SIP, is that schools are always improving, continuously improving. If we empower people, then there has to be accountability and authority. There's a reciprocal arrangement here with empowerment. And that's where we're trying to figure out, through this combination of best practice, how to do that. Grasping true north, reciprocity, providing the right training and support. Lifelong learning should be a commitment of all educators, in my view. How can we educate students and expect them to be lifelong learners if we are not? And then making sure that we have a true learning organization where there's sharing and collaboration, where it's okay to fail and learn. And so this is not a perfect world. And I hope that I've been able to convey that to you, that, the idea is this is a struggle. This is something we work through. But if we can use some of the best practices, then we can certainly gain the idea here that it is possible to do a better job and to make sure that we're actually fulfilling the moral imperative of education. Well, thanks for joining this lecture, and hope you do well in your studies. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next time.